In 1922, a young woman named Molly Maggia went to her dentist complaining of a toothache. When the dentist pulled the tooth, her jawbone crumbled in his hand. Within months, her entire jaw had to be removed. The infection spread through her skull. She died in agony at 24 years old. The company she had worked for told her family she died of syphilis. She had never had syphilis. She had spent years painting watch dials with radioactive paint and being told by her supervisors to lick the brush to keep a fine point. This is the story of the Radium Girls, and it is not just a story about radiation poisoning. It is a story about what corporations do when they know their product is killing people and choose to say nothing. In 1917, the United States Radium Corporation opened a factory in Orange, New Jersey to paint luminous watch dials for the military. The paint they used was called Undark, a radium-based paint that glowed in the dark. Hundreds of young women were hired to paint the dials by hand, using tiny brushes that required a precise point. Their supervisors taught them a technique called lip pointing, where they would put the brush in their mouth, press it to their lips, and pull it out to form a fine tip. They did this hundreds of times a day. The women were told the paint was completely safe. Some of them painted their nails and their teeth with it as a joke, knowing it would glow when the lights went off. They went home at night with their hair and skin shimmering faintly in the dark. They called themselves the Ghost Girls. The supervisors who told them the paint was safe wore lead aprons and handled radium with tongs. They just did not tell the women on the factory floor why. Inside the United States Radium Corporation, executives had access to research showing that radium was dangerous as early as 1914. By 1917, they knew their workers were being poisoned. They said nothing. By the early 1920s, women who had worked in the factory were beginning to get sick. Teeth fell out, jawbones crumbled. Bones in their legs and arms fractured spontaneously under normal body weight. Anemia hollowed them out from the inside. Some of the women's bones became so saturated with radium that they literally glowed in the dark when examined in a darkened room. The company's response was to hire a doctor to examine the sick workers and conclude that their conditions were unrelated to their work. The doctor's report was falsified. When independent researchers began investigating and pointing to radium as the cause, the company attacked their credibility and suppressed the findings. They hired lawyers to delay any legal action for as long as possible, knowing that many of the women were too sick to survive a lengthy court battle. 5 women decided to sue in 1927. By the time the case was heard in 1928, several of them were so ill they could not raise their arms to take the oath in court. One of them, Grace Fryer, had to wear a metal brace just to sit upright in the courtroom. The judge described their condition as the most pitiful spectacle he had ever seen in a court of law. The case drew national attention and public outrage. The company settled out of court in 1928, paying each woman around $10,000 and a small annual pension for as long as they lived. Several of them did not live long enough to collect more than a few payments. The settlement contained a clause preventing the women from filing any further legal action, regardless of how their conditions progressed. The company had effectively paid to close the door on any future accountability. Molly Maggia's body was exhumed in 1927 to determine the cause of her death. When researchers placed a Geiger counter near her remains, it clicked continuously. Her bones were still radioactive 5 years after her death. They remained radioactive for decades. The legal battle fought by the Radium Girls established several principles that became the foundation of worker safety law in the United States: the right of workers to sue employers for damages caused by workplace conditions. The principle that corporations could not knowingly expose workers to dangerous conditions and escape liability by falsifying medical reports. The framework that eventually led to the creation of occupational safety regulations across American industry. The women who were too sick to lift their arms in court changed the legal landscape for every worker in America who came after them. The United States Radium Corporation continued operating under various names for decades after the settlement. They were never criminally charged. No executive ever faced personal accountability for knowingly poisoning their workforce for years while hiding the evidence. The last of the Radium Girls died in 1938. Her bones were still radioactive. The sites where the radium paint factories operated remained contaminated for decades afterward. In the 1980s, environmental surveys found radioactive contamination in the soil around the former factory sites in New Jersey. Houses built on or near those sites were found to have elevated radiation levels. Some residents had been living on radioactive ground for years without knowing it. The Radium Girls are remembered today as heroes of the American labor movement. But the reason we need heroes is because the people in charge chose profit over lives and expected to get away with it. They almost did. The question the Radium Girls leave behind is not whether corporations are capable of knowing their product is killing people and saying nothing. The question is, how many times it has happened since, with products and chemicals and workplaces we have not yet investigated, and whether the people responsible are still getting away with it.